Welcome to Authors Revealed. I'm Becky Anderson. I'm so excited. We have a North Central College graduate, best-selling author. It's Rachel Louise Snyder and her new novel. It's called What We've Lost Is Nothing. Well, Rachel, welcome to Naperville, or I should say welcome back to Naperville.
It's good to be home.
Yeah. Anyway, I just want to congratulate you. This is your first novel. You already have, a book that's in print, but this is your first novel. And I just want to know, it's only been 1 week, I think 2 today, that the book has actually been out in the world. It's on shelves, people are picking it up. So what kind of comments are you getting from friends, family, readers in general? So what are you hearing? Because this is really exciting.
It's really, it is exciting. And I have to say, the thing I'm hearing from so many people, a good friend of mine, for example, is an editor in New York and has been for about 20 years. And she said, I saw her last week, and she said, I don't know how to say this in a way that won't sound bad, but I started reading your book and I just love it. And I'm so surprised. And I think what she was talking about was that I'm so known as a nonfiction writer. Right. And that's what I'm hearing from people who know my writing or who know, anything, or editors I've worked with or whatever, oh, you actually can, it doesn't read like a journalist has just written a novel. It actually reads like a novelist has written a novel. And so that's actually incredibly
That's
gratifying.
a huge that's fantastic. That's a huge compliment.
Yeah.
Because and then that's going to be one of my questions. That switch from being a journalist and doing everything you do, but in some ways you can see that journalist in you in this book.
That's what people say. I mean, it's sort of like trying to find yourself in your own kid. I don't really see it. I just know where it came from, and I think, for me, my only formal training has been as a writer has been in fiction. My MFA was in fiction at Emerson College. I studied with Tim O'Brien and Andre DeBuse and Ted Wiesner, and amazing writers. And so for me, journalism was something I learned on the job that kept me writing. And I developed a love for it, but I didn't start with a love for it in the way that I did for fiction.
So what took you this time to finally get into, what you got your MFA in and what you're actually, I think you're teaching in this.
I am. Well, I'm teaching all of them. I teach all, yeah.
But was it something you just weren't ready for, or is it just that this was the time to write this book?
I kept writing fiction after grad school as I was building up my nonfiction portfolio, as it were, and most of those books I didn't even show to my agent, but they were necessary. Somebody in an article referred to them as failed books, and I was like, I don't think they're failures at all. Just because something isn't published doesn't mean it wasn't a necessary exercise for me as a writer and for growth. And so I really only stopped writing fiction for about 6 or 7 years. I moved to Cambodia in 2003. I'm sure you'll ask me about that, but that was when I started writing my first book, and that was nonfiction. So I was pregnant when I did the book tour for that book, and I realized I had been covering, wars and natural disasters and humanitarian kinds of stories, and I just couldn't really do those pregnant. In fact, I had an assignment to go to Burma, way in the hinterlands of Burma. This is in 2007, and I found out I was pregnant 5 days before I was supposed to go, and I couldn't go.
Oh. Yeah.
I mean, I would have gone if it was ranked, the capital city. But anyway, so I just thought, well, now is the perfect time. I can't do the kinds of stories I was doing. I'm pregnant. I'm, living in Cambodia. I wasn't traveling around, and so I started writing this novel there. Actually,
okay.
And
so you have to thank your daughter for that, right?
I have to thank my daughter for everything, actually, of course. But I think for me, it felt like revisiting a beloved relative that you hadn't seen in a long time, and you were like, why hadn't I come to visit you earlier? Oh my God.
So it must have been a great feeling, though, to have,
it was a
to
good
have
feeling.
more of that freedom with what you're putting down on the page.
The first sentence I wrote of this book was in this place on the south coast of Cambodia called Kanai Bang Chet, which is actually also where I got married. And it's this beautiful, beautiful resort, sort of. I mean, it's only got a few rooms, but I started writing, and it was like the voice and the spectrum of characters were immediately there. It was really amazing, an amazing moment, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
So everything just sort of, the chemistry was right. Everything.
Yeah,
just
I mean,
fell into
other
place.
elements came later, but those two things were immediately there.
So tell us, you're talking about this. What was that germ, that little spark that got, what we've lost is nothing? What was it that started this story for you?
Well, I was in Vietnam on an assignment, and I was going around with the American military as they were looking for MIA. They do this. They have this arm of the military that still looks in places around the world. And so I lived in Cambodia at the time, so I just flew over to Vietnam and met them. And I met a woman who was from the New Yorker, and she was writing about the same mission. And she told me the story of a friend of hers from outside of Atlanta who in the 80s had been one of a series of homes burgled on this street in a single afternoon, and how eventually the neighbors, there were maybe 4 or 5 houses, and they all just left. They couldn't, within 2 years they were gone. It was like they, you know, because there isn't just, it wasn't just one break-in, it was like half the houses in this street, and it was unsettling in this deeply psychological way to them, and they all left eventually and moved to other parts of the country. And the minute she said it, it was like, what an amazing premise. She doesn't write fiction, and I said, can I use that in a novel? She said, sure. So that was the germ.
So that was suburban Atlanta where this took place, right?
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. So you set this book in, well, suburban Oak Park, Oak Park, Illinois. Mm-hmm. You know, I would say a suburb that you think of in a more progressive way. You know, it's more integrated. It's closer into the city. It sort of has, it has all those aspects that make Oak Park what it is: beautiful parks, Frank Lloyd Wright, everything that's there. But also, it also has, I think, people who want to move out of the city and don't want to move too far out will go to Oak Park.
Right.
You know, I know authors, publishers, reps, people who live in Oak Park. So why Oak Park? What made you choose that? Thinking about, okay, you hear the story about Atlanta or a suburb of Atlanta, and then you choose Oak Park.
Well, that's one of the things that I mentioned that came later. I had set it initially in sort of an unspecific geography that probably resembled whatever I think of as outside of Atlanta, which I've been to maybe once, you know.
Yeah, sure.
And so maybe a year or a year and a half into the writing, it was like something clicked, and I realized, you know, Oak Park is a fantastic setting because, as you say, it's a very urban suburb, and it's very progressive. And I lived there. I've lived there twice, actually. And the second time I lived there, I was part of a, you know, they're known for their integration programs, and they have had various incarnations of integration programs for about 40 years. And I worked in an integration program as a resident manager right near the Austin corridor. And it was a fantastic learning experience for me. I mean, I really, you know, I just was exposed to so much of the world and so much of history, and how tangible history is actually in this like remarkable way. But I realized that this is a place that offers, I think, fertile ground for exploring idealism and, you know, what happens when that idealism is undermined. And the book is set in 2004 and 2005, sort of very specifically, because at the time I went to visit Oak Park, and I was staying with a friend of mine, and I went to speak to a police chief who's now retired, a lieutenant commander, I think he was, and he told me that right around that time there had been a series of sort of high-profile crimes in Oak Park that were racial in some nature, or people's perception of them had to do with race. And he said it was so frustrating to him because he started to hear conversations around Oak Park that he had never heard before about maybe the integration thing doesn't work, maybe we shouldn't invest in this anymore. And so he wrote letters to the editor saying, but crime is lower than it's been in 20 years. But he really thought it was this kind of post 9/11 mood in the country. And so I quite purposely set my book at that time for all of those reasons.
So it's those feelings under the surface that you think things are okay, and people are, you know, accepting each other, and we're living in a community where we're living as a whole, but then something happens like this. But what I loved about the book is the way you told it from many different stories. The people in the street where the burglaries have taken, like the different families, and the layers of it, and the things, and it was just fascinating going from one family to another and hearing, you know, about this. So when did that extensive journalism experience you have kick in? Because like you say, you talked to this police lieutenant in Oak Park, or talking to different people. But when did that kick in that realized, oh, maybe I'll do some research on this? And
I did a little bit of research in a variety of ways. I mean, one was the police chief. We actually spent the day casing places in Oak Park. I was like, if you were going to burgle this house, what would you do? You know, and you know, there's things in the book like fences actually don't keep you any safer. They actually hide burglars, and he's the one that most of that came from. But I did research on French food. I did research. Some of the most fun research I did was on hemerolopia, which is a condition that one of the characters have, and it's day blindness, basically, where he can see a little bit and he can see at night, but light bothers him. And I have a professor at American University where I teach who actually does research on this.
Wow.
That was a total accident, right? Because I was not working at American University when I started the book. So I went into his lab and he actually did a mock experiment with me so that I had a kind of version of hemerolopia for a few minutes at a time. It was sort of crazy. So I did research on that. I did, obviously as a journalist, I've done stories that are really heavily researched. And I would say this is not really heavily researched. It's sort of lightly researched to make sure I had certain things right and whatever. But it's an ensemble of characters, sort of like the movie Crash. People compared it to Crash.
You can so see that comparison because you're hearing about an incident that some people have shared in, but you're hearing it from all different points.
That's right, and there's a lot of references to the Iliad in the book, and that's exactly where that comes from. It's supposed to be a chorus because I think, as I said, this isn't just one burglary; it's a whole street, and so there's a whole psychology around something like that happening that would be much, much different if it happened in real life. And so the ripple effect is that it will come up and people will have conversations about it in the community. And so there are these blogs and there are these listservs and they're commenting on this in the way that, in the Iliad, the gods are always commenting on the crazy stuff that's going on down below. And I remember reading the Iliad and thinking but if you know that Achilles is going to kill Hector and Hector's a pretty nice guy, you're the gods, can't you just stop it? But no, they can't, And so I wanted the same function with the blogs and listservs, and it also allowed people to be just jerks, right? Listservs
exactly. And there are those.
Show me a listserv where people aren't ornery, and I'll be shocked.
For sure. So did you and I keep going back to your journalist background. Having since this is fiction, having those fictitious sort of interviews with your characters in your head. Did that occur in a way, or was it more of just that wasn't part of it? You kind of kick back to those days of your creative writing.
No, I think it's hard as a writer to disentangle the process in that way for me. But I certainly drew a map of the area, and I certainly made biographies of the characters, which of course don't all come through. I mean, they never would, but I wanted to know these characters. I wanted to make sure they sounded different. I wanted to make sure they had different attitudes. I wanted to make sure they had different ideologies and experiences and things like that. So a lot of my journalism came for example, in the Cambodian family. I lived in Cambodia for 6 years, and so I didn't really research that part because I know it so well. I mean, you could argue that I spent 6 years researching that, but I wanted their experience to come through a little bit. So, and I did do timelines of every character. Actually.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
because I guess that gives you depth in a way.
It gives me depth, but it also is when you write a book. This book takes place in about 24 hours, and there's things happening simultaneously. So while this character's over here, this one's over here, and I wanted to make sure that all made sense, and that logistically they could be here or they could be there.
So you had to keep it all straight.
I had to keep it all straight, and it was hard actually.
The title comes from Michael McPherson, one of the families. His daughter, 15-year-old daughter, is the one who's home during the robbery. But that title comes from something he says: "What we've lost is nothing compared to what we in this neighborhood, on this street, will always have." And once you hear about the premise of this and you kind of figure out the place, the setting where it takes place, you can totally get what he says, because nothing will ever be the same. And what we've lost is nothing, but really there's a bigger idea to what behind all of this.
That's right. And he's sort of the blowhard of the book.
Really?
People actively dislike him, which is sort of the point.
I was let you say that first. Okay.
He was way worse in the initial draft, I have to tell you.
Okay, so you toned him down a little bit.
Yeah, I've toned him down. But I also think he, I think he's vulnerable in a way because he shares that fear that all parents have of what happens when my child realizes that I actually don't have any control? That's a terrifying moment. Sure. I have a 5-year-old. She's not there yet. She still thinks I have total control. Right. And I still think that.
Yeah.
But he doesn't know how to articulate his love. And of course, at the end of the book, he does articulate it, but he articulates it in a way that is so unbelievably destructive. And so I think you have, one of the reviewers, one of the bloggers wrote on this Columbia Journal blog that's just, it's actually an exquisitely written review. Like if I could give that as a model, it's complimentary of the book, but even apart from that, like was a brilliant. And one of the things she talked about was how, in him in particular, good and evil reside sort of simultaneously. And I feel like that's true of the community, and that's true of most of us, if we're honest. Yeah. And so he says what we've lost is nothing because he hasn't grasped all that he's actually lost. Yeah. And at the end, he loses quite a lot, actually. Yeah. No spoilers.
No spoilers.
No
spoilers
spoilers here.
Yeah.
So there's a sadness, I think, in that phrase.
Yeah. And I think it's too, we think of communities that are trying to create some sort of utopia, or trying to make things right in a lot of different aspects. But there's always that under the surface, and it will always be there. But it takes that catalyst to make something, those eruptions.
Absolutely. And who doesn't want to be the best version of themselves?
Well, yeah.
Right? We all do. And sometimes
things happen, and we aren't what we think we should be.
Yeah.
So, the whole thing about the feelings and when people are robbed, whether it's you're on the street or it's your home or whatever happens, that sense of violation that takes place. And did you interview a lot of people who've been through this experience for the book?
It's interesting. One of my very, very best friends had been through this experience, not mass burglary, but her apartment. And it was funny because she lived in Andersonville in an apartment on the 3rd floor. And people sometimes think in an apartment you're safe, but in fact, I learned as a resident manager that oftentimes the 3rd floor, if it's a 3-story building, is the one where there's the least amount of traffic, so you're most vulnerable. Actually, you're probably safer on the 1st floor. Not always, but anyway. Yeah. I talked to her a lot, and she too ended up leaving that apartment sort of shortly after. I mean, I think it really, I had a lot of talks about this very thing with a friend of mine who was a writer, and he had read the book, and he said, it doesn't yet feel, it's not like a real crime, right? It's not like anyone has been physically hurt or whatever, and yet you still have this sense of, oh my God,
someone uninvited has been in my space.
In my space, right? It's even different than I think getting robbed out in the street. So I did a lot of editing after I talked to him because I think that's the thing of it is you have these aphorisms like, well, thank God no one was hurt, but I think actually people quite are hurt in these ways that are wholly intangible. There's a scene in the book where a very, very minor character just has a total meltdown. Yeah. And it's really kind of an emotional release for all of them in that moment because they realize that's how they all feel. Right. But they're hearing all this thing like, oh, thank God no one got hurt. Oh, it's only just stuff.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't feel that way when it's your stuff.
That's right. So the whole thing about what you said and researching it, you said you were a manager at a apartment complex, or where was it? Was this something you did for your research? Because wow, that would bring some depth to viewing. Well, looking at people who live, in a community, whatever community it is.
Yeah, I didn't do it for the book. I did it right after grad school.
Oh, you did? Okay. Yeah. I was wondering when you had
I wrote a piece actually in the New York Times Magazine about it maybe a month ago when I was an apartment manager in Oak Park.
Well, I'm going to read this because I got those magazines sitting at home.
Yeah, it was like the middle of December.
Okay, I will make sure.
Yeah, and so I was a manager, a resident manager, and my job was, of course I had to clean. I was not so good at that part of my job, actually, clean and shovel snow especially. But I showed apartments. I was sort of the go-to person for, I think there were 34 units in my building. It was one of those old, beautiful brownstones in Oak Park. So, I was the go-to when the heater would go out, radiator wasn't working, or something happened. I did this for 6 years. We had floods, fires, we had drug dealing out of there. We had teenagers on, crack. We had domestic abuse. I mean, just every kind of scenario that you could imagine. Right. I experienced during my 6 years there. And it was, in the Austin area of Oak Park. It was part of the diversity assurance program. But my real job was to create community. Yeah, was to get people of different races and different backgrounds and different economic scales and different experiences to live together as renters, in this building.
Yeah. And was that a tough thing to do? Or do people just sort of, they want that community, but yet there's, you know.
I think everybody wants it.
Yeah.
I think people have different ideas about how to go about it. It was tough. It was tough to get, someone who was an African American woman in her 50s to hang around with someone who had just graduated from medical school and was 25, and was white and grew up in the suburbs. So those were tough. Sure. But what you want is you don't want people necessarily hanging out like we're all gonna, whatever.
Yeah.
But you do want people to know who their neighbors are. You want them to feel like their neighbors are people they can call in a crisis, and that's tough in a rental building. There's a lot of turnover, and but you know what? There's a lot of things in the world I'm not good at, but like throwing a party is not one of them. Like I'm an excellent party thrower, so in that way, the job was really well suited for me.
Oh, great. Yeah, glad to hear. Okay, with this book compared to your previous piece of a book of nonfiction, and thinking that I've always thought about when you want to tell some truths, sometimes you can do it better with fiction because you're feeling in the gaps with emotion that you can't put in when you have to be totally objective on something. Right. So was that freeing when you be able to do that? Because you can tell the story of this that you never would have gotten from any kind of article in the newspaper or a magazine or anything like that. Absolutely.
I think you can uncover moral depths with fiction. I think you're absolutely, like you nailed it when you said you can have conversations that you couldn't have. For years, when I lived in Oak Park, I was friends with Ira Glass, who was the host of This American Life. And I used to say to him, like, Ira, I want to do a story for This American Life about the diversity assurance program in Oak Park. It's like amazing. They're trying to get blacks and whites to live together. Like, it's fantastic. Like, I love it. It's and he would say, that's great. That's awesome. What's the story? And I'd be like, right.
Yeah.
Like what I had was a setting or an issue, but I didn't have a story or a narrative.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite understand that at the time either. And that's what I love about fiction is that you can have characters conversing in a way that is very difficult, I think, in real life for all of us. So, I found it totally freeing.
No, I bet. There's to this story and the different people involved on that street and how they're relating to their community and everything. It's always that us versus them kind of thing. And I think you really point out the differences in, socioeconomic level, education, immigration, those who've been here for a long, all those different layers are part of this. And there's always that pretension, everything's cool. We're all cool with one another. But then there's that little thing that happens.
I think anytime a situation, people's real, true nature comes out in times of heightened emotional moments, and I've been in them. I'm not a war reporter, and I'm not a frontline kind of swaggering journalist. I'm way too scared, but I have been in hostile environments, and I've certainly covered a lot of natural disasters, and I think there is this kind of like, there's only one bottle of water. I'm going to fight you for it. I'll fight you for it. And I think that's human nature. I remember being in Honduras after Hurricane Mitch, and this was 1998, and hearing about massive fights that broke out over bricks. I want this brick. I'm not going to let you take this brick. I'm sure this is from my house. And I think that unfortunately that is the stuff we're made of.
Right. So, your research, and I know you had for Fugitive Denim, your other piece about the globalization and, taking a pair of jeans and where it begins and picking cotton on the Iranian border.
That is not a career choice I recommend.
No, I know, but that's incredible.
Yeah.
But doing those experiences brings so much more weight and power to a piece of nonfiction. You want to tell somebody something. This is a story you need to know.
Yeah.
But what was that like?
Oh my gosh, that is honestly one of my most hilarious and horrifying days as a journalist, because I'm in Azerbaijan, which most people I know can't even pronounce, let alone locate on. I just certainly knew very little about it, and I'm on the Iranian border, and I'm trying to interview cotton, pickers who are all women, by the way, in this part of the world, and most parts of Africa too. They're all women. It's backbreaking work. And the woman that I interviewed, Ganira, was 32. She was this tiny little 100-pound woman, and she said, "Yeah, I'll talk to you, but you have to carry my cotton bag for the day, and you have to help me." And I was like, "Sure, of course."
Yeah, it's just cotton.
Immersion journalism. It's cotton.
Yeah.
How much does a Q-tip weigh? Not very much. Well, you know what? a giant bag of Q-tips weighs a lot.
Yeah.
And so I'm wearing this thing, you tie it around your waist, and then you have it between your legs and you're walking. And, you know, the first hour is fine, and then it starts to drag behind you. Keep in mind that I'm also taking notes as I'm talking to her,
Right.
and I'm like, you know, stopping and putting them. And you get this like white coating on your hands, and cotton plants are very, I mean, there's parts of them that are really sharp, so you get little tiny cuts.
Yeah.
And, oh my gosh. And you know, by the end of the day, my back was like, and this woman does this all day, every day, you know.
Right.
And she was 32, she looked 50.
Right, and we have no idea where these kind of pants come from.
Yeah.
I mean, where
Denim.
pants? Yeah, denim.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but I wouldn't, had I just gone after work and interviewed her in her home, I would not have had the experience of just how, the kind of drudgery that is.
Right,
So,
right. So
yeah.
I kind of think you approach this piece of fiction, though, in some ways the same way. You know, you got to get inside people's heads. You got to, you have to know how they're not only in their minds, but also what their emotions and their hearts are feeling.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, people ask me all the time, like, which character I most identify with. And the truth is, there are elements of me in all of them. Even Michael McPherson, the least likable of them all.
We all got some Michael McPherson.
I know. I mean, I just, you know,
Right.
you say the wrong thing in the wrong moment, and it's like, oh, why did I do that?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. So, where did you moved from Pittsburgh when you were 12 years old? And you moved to?
Yeah, where was our first place? Well, the western suburbs.
Western suburbs.
Yeah,
okay.
I think it was Woodridge.
Woodridge?
We only
Okay.
lived there for like maybe 6 or 9 months,
Okay.
and then we moved to Lisle,
Right?
but right near the Naperville border, and we lived there for a number of years. And then I left home at 16. I mean,
Right.
left is a bit of a euphemism. It was a mutual divorce between my parents and I, and I lived in, oh my gosh,
Right.
every western suburb
Yeah.
in Illinois.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah.
Woodridge, Downers Grove, Aurora,
Right.
Naperville, Lisle.
And so what I want to hear is how you ended up in getting accepted into North Central College, and a certain person that both of us know made a big difference in your life. Can you tell us a little about that? Because I think that's a fascinating story.
Yeah. You know, I've lived outside of America a number of times and for a number of years, and I will say, for all of its faults, America is a land of second chances. I feel that in such a palpable way, and the older I get, the more I feel it.
What a great time, a fantastic conversation with best-selling author Rachel Louise Snyder, and she's a North Central College graduate. Her first novel is called What We've Lost Is Nothing. Thanks for joining me on Authors Revealed.